Welcome to Legal Innovation Spotlight, the podcast that brings you the latest advancements in legal tech and knowledge management. I'm Ted Theodoropoulos, and I connect with the industry's brightest minds to provide you with valuable insights and actionable takeaways. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Mr. Berget, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about the move from SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint Online. And what inspired the conversation was just all the conversations that we're having with law firms who are trying to allocate budget to making the transition next year. And they have so many questions, like how much is this going to cost? What resources do I need? What sort of timeline should I allocate? All of those sorts of things. I think law firms are shooting in the dark a little bit. So I figured, what better person than you, who's had a front row seat and managed so many of these migrations. So we're going to talk through all of that and more. But before we jump into that, why don't you just take a second or two and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Kameron Berget. I'm with Infodash for the past 6 years or so, but I've been in the Microsoft tech stack for nearly 20, working with SharePoint, doing these migrations back when it used to be content database attached migrations and the old traditional things, but primarily focusing in SharePoint and kind of moving into that cloud space after, circa 2016, 17 or so. So been primarily focused on product development here at Infodash for the past several years, and we're excited to talk about some of the things we have upcoming.
Awesome. Yeah, so I wanted to start the conversation off with what I think firms are most concerned with, especially during budget season, and that's cost. So most big firms have enterprise agreements, and they've already got Microsoft 365 licensing, and it really focuses around other factors like, is this going to be just a lift and shift? Is this what sort of third-party products like Infodash or others might they need? How far down the continuum they want to go in terms of capabilities. So let's just kind of start off at the top, lift and shift or complete overhaul. In my experience, I don't know if this is consistent with you, but most of the migrations that we've been involved in and have had visibility to, they're not lifting and shifting. They're lifting and shifting content, but the challenge with, lifting and shifting an on-prem deployment to SharePoint Online, one of the challenges, there's several, but if you have any customizations that exist, there's a good chance that those aren't going to run because the development model is different in SharePoint Online, and just that whole, it's just a different space when it comes to customization. So is that in line with what you've seen as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's really three phases. I mean, the old phase was the old school on-prem, like for like, 2010 to 2013. Then we moved into this realm where we migrated to the cloud from classic still to classic. And then with the advent of modern pages and really tipping the scales going to full modern, now we're really looking at overhaul because there's not really a like for like lift and move from even SharePoint 2019 or 16 to the cloud. There's just so many changes. And it presents an opportunity to take a look at things and say, okay, how should we be doing things differently? How do we fit better into that ecosystem of SharePoint Modern?
Yeah. Okay. So SharePoint Modern, from classic to modern, that's a really good distinction. So when did SharePoint Modern kind of make its way into the ecosystem?
I mean, it's still going, right? Microsoft has a lot of system pages and things that are still administrative that are still on classic, which is frustrating. But I mean, it was 2016 when it first hit the market as kind of just site pages. Now you've got, navigation, site pages. Most of the management pages are there. They're still kind of trickling in changes, but it's been a 5 or 6 year deal. And, slowly things are coming over. And I think it's been probably 2 or 3 years since it's really tipped the scales where modern is the de facto standard. We still have firms today that have tenants that we're stepping into that have the classic root page, meaning they've had this for 5 or 6 years, whereas new tenants in 365 by default get that modern site collection. So there's some stages to that for migration too, because we can do something called a site swap. So it's not always taking things and moving it directly into modern. On the root site, sometimes we have to move those things around and kind of do what we call site swapping to get that classic to modern conversion done.
Yeah. And, something too, I think that factors into a firm strategy on whether or not they're going to lift and shift or overhaul is the refresh cycle with legal intranets. In my experience, we've only been through a few, like two, it's like 6, 7, 8 years, right? And the catalyst in my experience behind what drives that is there's some sort of innovation. Like the last big one was SharePoint 2013, right? When that was kind of a light years ahead release from 2010. And 2010 was a pretty big upgrade from 2008. But 2013, when it kind of hit the market, a lot of firms decided, you know what, our intranet is a little long in the tooth. Let's go ahead and make the investment, get on a modern platform. And now that's happening again with SharePoint Online, right? So, but that's been, SharePoint 2013, that's 10 years old. So if you have a 10-year-old intranet, it needs to be reimagined. And a lot of the people that we're seeing, a lot of the firms, they literally have 10-year-old intranets, sometimes older, right?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, with SharePoint 2013, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I know we got a little bit of delay here. So so I think that is another driver on, lift and shift versus overhaul. It's if your SharePoint environment, you haven't made any major changes in, I'll even go as short as 3 years, but definitely 5, you need to be looking at a whole new kind of redesign, a new, taxonomy strategy, navigational approach, overall design. You probably need to reevaluate the content that you have, your enterprise search strategy, what third-party frameworks, everything has changed. So if you're more, where would you put the line in terms of if you haven't done an overhaul in X years, you almost certainly need to. What is X in your mind?
Yeah, I think if you're even on 2013, you need to consider that change. Mostly because the consideration to the cloud is, the architecture, like you mentioned, has changed, much more flat. Some of the things you probably did in 2013 don't really happen in SharePoint Online, right? We may be copying content from one location to another to get it to show up, whereas in SharePoint Online, we can natively reach into those data sources. And so there's a lot of things architecturally and technically that have changed from 2013 to the cloud that it almost makes sense to just default think that you're going to reimagine what you actually do and how you do it. Not only from just the standard content, but customizations as well, right? None of those customizations are portable. You can't take them and move them. You could you could rework them into a SharePoint framework solution, but taking a step back and looking at each one of those things and saying, are we doing this the right way? And how can we do it in a more modern way in the future is a good first step, I think, from coming from 2013. Now there is 2019, 2016, the subscription model, models that have been really the cloud first of on-prem, right? We've kind of changed the roles here where the cloud has dictated the first version of the on-premises SharePoint. But even then, we're on such an older version of the SharePoint framework there that customizations and things really don't translate one-to-one to the cloud. So when we think about moving to the cloud, the first step is really how can we reimagine this? And make the life simpler, right? I mean, the old development model was much more difficult than the new one.
And when you say old development model, are we talking about full trust solutions?
Yeah, full trust feature framework, right? Back then, I would say you had SharePoint developers and then regular developers, modern web developers, right? There was 2 separate categories of developers. Today, if you're a front end React guy, you can write code within SharePoint, right? It's a much more standard modern tool chain that allows you to do things that aren't just the SharePoint way anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. That the predecessor company to Infodash was AcroWire. We used to do a ton of SharePoint development, and everything was different. Even like the development environment that we used to have to buy guys these monster laptops with 32 gigs of RAM. They used to have to run server infrastructure on their laptop, which is kind of hilarious. We're glad a lot of those things have changed because it really, what it led to was a lot of lone wolf kind of um, development patterns, right? Because it was
Right.
difficult. If everybody's running their own SharePoint server instance, there became challenges collaborating when you weren't working on a common environment, where you kind of had to push those, um, push those changes into a dev or a UAT or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the modern tool chain is, the it used to be, well, now we have, DevOps, things like that can help us seamlessly integrate with as teams. And then obviously, like you mentioned, pushing to the cloud and seeing everything in one unified place and not having to run SQL Server and SharePoint Server on our local machines. That's definitely a plus.
Yeah. So, all right, we're still talking about estimating costs. So whether or not they're going to do just a migration or kind of a reimagination of the platform, that's a huge consideration. And then third-party frameworks like Infodash, right? There's not much in the legal specific space, but if they're going to integrate data from back-end systems, they've got to choose something like the Infodash product or something like it, or they kind of have to develop those integrations on their own, because Microsoft really, like, does BCS even still exist? Like, how do firms, if they don't use something like Infodash, how do firms get data into SharePoint web parts?
Right. So right now, I think my last count was Microsoft out of the box has about 45 web parts that you can use out of the box. Out of those 45, only about 10 to 14 or so support even dynamic content, right? Where we're actually fetching content from multiple sites or multiple lists to display on the page. All those other web parts are static, meaning I have to go to the page, edit the content to actually see that update. Now, natively, you could use Power Automate and Flow to use an on-premise data gateway to fetch data and push it into a SQL or push it into a SharePoint list or maybe an Azure database or something. And so you could do those types of things, but it's much more of a heavy lift than, of course, than kind of taking a shortcut to a third-party tool like Infodash. So Infodash approaches that a little differently, where we've kind of flipped the script. Our entire model is dynamic, right? So when we're looking at an intranet, we don't want to have to focus on going to every page to update content. We want pages to be populated dynamically with content where it lives. And you can do that out of the box. It just takes much more tooling, um, much more infrastructure and setup to be able to accomplish the same task that a third-party tool can kind of shortcut you to.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, all right, so that's another consideration. So you got to decide if you want to do a reimagination or just a lift and shift. Are you going to use any third-party frameworks? That's going to obviously contribute to the cost. And then, what stage intranet? So here at Infodash, we've built kind of like a maturity model. So we've got stage 1 through 4.
Correct.
How far down the path does a firm want to go on that continuum? Do they want to just stick with a stage 1 as a kind of a Gen 1 release, or do they want to go further? Like, just so the audience has some understanding of what we mean by that. Like, what's in scope for like a stage 1, because that's kind of we feel like the minimum viable product for a legal intranet, right? Is
Right.
stage 1. What's all in scope?
Yeah, so what we consider a stage 1 intranet is that informational intranet. So we have, we have a home site that's connecting you with the firm. We've got practice, department sites, committees, a firm directory, right? Things where I can find people. So it's the basic things that you would see in an intranet. And even today, when we look at some of the more advanced intranets, the bulk of the intranet is made up of that foundational stage 1 approach, where we're connecting you with departments and people and practices and news and events and those core things that we always assume of an intranet. And when we look at moving to the cloud, that is the best starting point, right? Trying to boil the ocean and get to a stage 3 or stage 4 when you're already making a huge leap from on-prem to the cloud is a big ask. And we've always talked, and everybody's always heard the mantra of kind of crawl, walk, run. When we look at migrations from on-prem to the cloud, looking at and focusing on what are the top 5 must-haves, right? I need to be able to communicate firm news and kind of have that digital water cooler for my employees. I need to be able to have events. I need to be able to find people. I want to have a landing spot for all my practices and departments, right? Having those 5 or 6 must-haves and nice-to-haves, focusing on those first. What that allows you to do is incrementally get yourself into the cloud, whether that's through attrition of maybe we move site after site one at a time, and then letting your users react to that and provide feedback and say, okay, this is what I would like to see, right? You can get too far down the path, assuming what you know that they want to see. And once you get to modern, they see these new things and say, hey, this would be great if we could do this or do this. If you move too far down that path and try to get to 2 and 3, you sometimes lose that opportunity to kind of pivot and make changes based on your user feedback. So I think starting small and then gradually ramping up is a key to success when you're taking that big leap from on-prem to the cloud.
That's great advice. And we have very big law firm clients who are also starting with stage 1, right?
Yep.
So it doesn't matter. We're not talking to the smaller or mid size of the market here going, hey, you guys should start here because you may not have the same resources as one of these firms with thousands of attorneys. Even the firms with thousands of attorneys are starting with stage 1. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what we're recommending as well. I mean, you might sprinkle in some of the stage 2, like some social aspects, or maybe client matter dashboarding or financials. You can sprinkle those things in, but those things become much more attainable and successful if you have that foundation there. And also, one of the benefits of starting small or smaller, kind of that crawl, walk, run approach, is that now we can incrementally show value that keeps people coming back. If things are changing, and it's kind of like the Microsoft 365 suite, every week we jump in, we see things that are moving around and changing and becoming better. Your intranet can be the same way in modern and SharePoint Online. We can change things and bring on new features seamlessly to users, which will keep them coming back, which is our ultimate goal, of having an intranet or a collaboration platform.
Yeah. All right. So lift and shift versus overhaul, third-party frameworks, what stage of the intranet? These are all factors. Another factor is, are you going to do a custom design, or are you going to just use out-of-the-box modern? And out-of-the-box modern looks pretty good. Like I've been around SharePoint forever, and most people who want a custom design want it because they don't want it to look like just out-of-the-box SharePoint, because
Right.
it used to be terrible. It's not bad. I mean, it's not perfect, but things have come a long way. But that's a big contributor to the cost equation as well, right? Are you going to go custom design or out of the box?
Yeah, absolutely. And out of the box, like you said, I mean, you get a full-on theme, logos, things that really match your brand and your style guide. In the past, we could deviate from out of the box as much as we wanted using master pages, right? Today, staying within the guardrails of what Microsoft is offering you is important, because you can get bit otherwise, right? There's some things we can do to kind of dance around the edges and make things look our way, but I think finding what you can do out of the box from a design perspective is key, right? You want to have that context that I can see that I'm on my corporate intranet or my corporate extranet or client team sites, those types of things. But we don't have to, again, boil the ocean. We can create things like, logos, color palettes, making sure our web parts all respond to those things, so that they look like they're part of our internal application set without having to go a full-on design. Now, full-on design definitely still has its place. We want intranets are generally your publishing platform, so they become more polished. But that's also something that can incrementally get better over time, right? You can give users the context, understand that they're within a application within the firm, while still kind of incrementally adding to that, brand awareness and matching the internal color schemes and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. And then, finally, I think, and this could be a big one in terms of the cost equation, is do you have custom solutions that need to be replatformed for SPO, for SharePoint Online, right? Do you have full trust web parts on-prem that you are business critical that need to be rebuilt in SPFX? Because there is no migration path from a full trust web part to SharePoint Online, correct?
Correct. Yep. You can't lift and move those WSPs up to the cloud and plan on using them. You have to reimagine them. And a lot of things that we cracked open code for in the past, Infodash can now, specifically third-party tools can take right off the shelf and probably replace a lot of that, right? Because we're jumping 10 years ahead in technology in most cases, where the things that we cracked open code for before probably don't have to do it anymore. So there's that reason alone is good to just reevaluate, do we need this? And then looking at the whole M365 suite, right? We have just a ton of tools at our disposal that can be used to do things more out of the box, more aligned within the guardrails of what Microsoft's providing, without having to crack open code, because we know that as soon as we do that, we have to maintain that for the life of that code, changes, bug fixes, all of those things, which are obviously solutions that we're trying to help firms with.
Yeah, and if you have developers on your staff, I used to be one. They're real eager to get in there and write some code. That's what they do, right? But
Right.
when you're looking at TCO, total cost of ownership, the maintenance component of that equation is bigger than the development piece of it. And people don't realize that. I mean, we had Dave Bolin on the podcast a couple episodes ago, and they were all the way across the goal line with theirs, and it was
Right.
with their intranet, and it was the maintenance, just the cost and the distraction of their resources managing all of the maintenance around it, that they decided to pivot and to go just out of the box Infodash. So that's something that gets lost sometimes, especially if you have technical guys like I used to be, going, man, I really want to code that. But all right, so tying a bow on the cost component. So lift and shift versus overhaul. Are you going to
Sure.
reimagine it, or are you going to try to? Going to be a struggle, but are you going to try to really replicate what you have on prem? Third-party frameworks. You need something like Infodash. If you do, we can certainly help you understand what those costs are for budgeting purposes. What stage intranet? How far down that maturity continuum do you want to travel for a Gen 1 release? Custom design versus out of the box. Again, if you're looking for opportunities for cost savings, an out of the box SharePoint modern site doesn't look too bad.
Right.
And then finally, custom solutions. So, how much do you have? How many customizations do you have on prem that have to make the move, and what's going to be involved in making that transition?
Right. Absolutely. And to
Yeah,
tie a bow
I
on that
think
last
I think
piece
that's a
there of
good.
custom development is, you have to remember, in the cloud too, everything's moving at a different pace too, right? On prem, we would write solutions for a certain version of SharePoint, and it might be a couple of years before we have to rewrite that solution. Whereas today, SharePoint framework's coming out with a new version, every quarter, sometimes sooner, right? So we're having to stay on top. This is a much more evergreen model. So as soon as we start cracking open code, the maintenance is key on that. Right? That code is living and breathing and has to mature along with your intranet, which is moving much faster than the traditional on-prem.
It's a great point. All right, so estimating costs for those of you out there who are working up your 2024 budgets and need to put a placeholder in for a potential migration. Those are the things you need to think about. If you need more help thinking through them, we're happy to help you do that. All right, let's move to kind of the next part of the conversation, and that's like planning your migration. So I think this is true, but I don't know it. Like every AmLaw firm, you're going to SharePoint Online. It's not if, it's when you're going.
Right.
And it's not because I said so and I'm making some bold prediction here. It's just Microsoft's not going to leave you any choice. They really already haven't.
Right.
You've got the SharePoint framework that's multiple versions back from SharePoint Online. They just have made it so painful to stay on prem that firms aren't going to have a choice. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Microsoft made that decision even when they released SPFX, SharePoint Framework, the development extension model for SharePoint, back in 2016, and then it's never really evolved from there. Even last month, I think they did upgrade the on-prem version, but it had a huge regression problem, right? So Microsoft's always had it in their path where they're not going to advance on-prem like they do the cloud, which is going to, like you said, force you into moving into the cloud eventually, right? They're 14 versions, if not more, behind on-prem than they are in the cloud. And so that, if that, in the last few years, and that hasn't changed. So that tells you what Microsoft's trying to get you to do is to get you to the cloud. So I think, like you said, it's not if, it's when.
Yeah. Yeah, if you like being 14 versions back, stay on prem, but I don't
Yep.
think that you do. So let's probably don't want to do that. So, all right. So again, planning the migration, it's always a good time to ask questions about what's being used and what's not, right? So, how can firms go about doing an inventory, almost like a current state assessment of what they have today and whether or not it's being used? Do they need third-party tools for that? Is it there's something in SharePoint Central Admin that can help? Like how would they go about that?
Yeah, there's some built-in tools and reports that you could use to glean some information, albeit very vanilla. Things like, you have some search reports and some basic things that could tell you how it's being used. I always resort to PowerShell, kind of the Swiss Army knife of SharePoint, even online and on-prem, to be able to slice and dice not only the sites, but the activity on those sites and say, okay, what is actually being used? What we've found is that sometimes it's as little as 30 to 40% of what's out there is actually being used. And if you look at that from an effort perspective and a cost perspective, that's a huge shift in what I actually have to move. Because one key thing to remember is the impetus to move on to SharePoint Online is partly Microsoft, but it's partly because of aging physical hardware, right? We have firms that are sitting on server 2012, and they need to get off these servers to get to the cloud. It doesn't mean that the 70% that might not be being used is going to go away. We can still link back to that kind of archive data if we need to get access to it, or throw it in a content database, or whatever we need to do. It just means we're going to focus the effort on the things that we know we need, which is those top five, those must-haves. And so the tools that you can use, if you have tools at your disposal, like a migration tool, ShareGate, if you already have a license for it, it's not a cheap license to go out and buy it for this purpose, but ShareGate can do some inventory for you. There's a bunch of open source scripting too that you can use to kind of go through and glean information about what's actually being used in your site today.
Yeah, after moving cross country, we moved from Charlotte to St. Louis 6 years ago, and I realized when I got to St. Louis that most of the stuff that I moved, I didn't even need. Like, we had a big, semi-trailer full of stuff. So now we've moved again since. I've learned a very valuable lesson through that is I get like a 20-yard dumpster and put it in my driveway, and I clean house extensively.
Right.
Actually, I do it periodically now. My wife has really become addicted to the purging process. So like once a year, we'll get like a 10-yard dumpster. It's like $300. It's the same concept, but just with your SharePoint environment, right? Don't pay to move a bunch of stuff that you don't need. It's not only unproductive, it generates clutter in your destination. Like I had a basement full of stuff that sat there until I could, figure out that I needed to get rid of it.
Right. And we actually just met with a firm this week who said they did that. They moved everything that they had on their current intranet. They wanted to get to the cloud. They moved it to the cloud themselves, but nothing changed. Still links to old data, documents that haven't been updated in years. And so, that's an opportunity at that point to kind of re-engage your user base. And if you lift and move the things that are stale and that nobody uses, they're just going to look at it and be like, oh, nothing's changed. I'm not going to use that anymore, right? So it's important to focus on the things that that they need, because you need that adoption, right? We need them going there and kind of being that front porch to start their day.
Yeah. So rent the I guess the advice is rent a dumpster before you move.
Exactly.
What about like information architecture, right? Like information architecture is something that oftentimes gets overlooked because it sounds super technical, but it's really a way to structure your content and navigation in alignment with hopefully how users think about engaging with the content. And that sometimes changes over time for a number of reasons, right? A firm can open up new practice areas or have organizational changes, or maybe even, in the legal world, this happens all the time, merge or acquire firms, and all of that has to be accounted for in an information architecture. So, it seems like that's a good time. What, in terms of like level of effort, how big of a lift is taking a look at existing taxonomies and IA and, maybe creating new strategies? Is that a heavy lift, or is that something that, some stakeholders can do in a short period of time?
Yeah, stakeholders can definitely jump in. So traditionally with SharePoint Classic and on-prem, we've had a much more vertical information architecture, right? Sometimes navigation even drove the decisions as to why we'd create subsites, right? We wanted to have it, departments / information technology, right? We wanted that URL to say that. And in order to do it, we created these subsites and became very vertical in our information architecture. In the cloud, Microsoft's, again, making the decision for you to push you away from those subsites, right? That's in, I think, even new tenants now, that's being disabled. You can't even create subsites. And so our information architecture is becoming much more horizontal. And Microsoft's throwing some crazy limits at you, saying you can have up to 2 million sites and even more. So like, there's no reason to think we can't go horizontal. And one of the things to think about is how does my current content fit into that new model? And so stakeholders can very easily come through and say, okay, here's the content we have. How does that fit into the new model? I always used to say on-prem is that the site collection itself is the security boundary. So it naturally, site collection to site collection, they don't know of one another, and that's a primary security benefit. It's a great place to start when you're scaling a site. It was on-prem, and it's currently how it is in the cloud. You scale by creating more site collections. So understanding how that flat taxonomy has really changed will help you map what you currently have into a new information architecture. And then leveraging taxonomy. So we can still give the user the feeling that they're navigating through a tree that's much deeper than it is in reality. But we do that with taxonomy. So things like rich navigation, right? If I'm on the department site, it can say I traversed there from the department landing page and then the home page. In reality, we're not 3 levels deep. We're really just 1 level deep. But we're giving the user a perception of that. So they have that feeling of, a rich architecture where we can easily slide things into there too, right? Practices, departments, offices, committees, teams. Those types of things are easily slid in. And it really simplifies how we deploy things in the cloud.
It's interesting. I almost think of Teams, right? Teams has a very flat information architecture, right? You have teams and channels. There's no sub channels. And, it creates opportunities and challenges, I think, right? Like when firms are looking at how to align the information architecture in teams to how their business operates, like a lot of times they'll say, hey, we'll have client teams and matter channels. Well, what happens if your client is Meta, right? And you've got subsidiaries, and you want to have that structure, that hierarchy reflected in your information architecture within teams. Well, you don't really have an option. I mean, you could do something through, there are some workarounds, right? You could do something through naming convention. There are some third-party tools out there that give you kind of a synthetic way to represent those hierarchies, right? Like Intap Workspaces has some capabilities, but is that a good parallel? The kind of the way Microsoft wants you to go more. When you say flat, it's you've got tenant, site collections, sites, and subsites, right? And what you're saying is the subsites piece is really they're de-emphasizing that as an approach.
Yeah, so you've got the tenant, the site collection, and then pages. Really, that's kind of the 3 major tiers that we have today. And then, of course, your lists and libraries that sit within that root site. But I think the Teams analogy is great because the other thing that should be done when you're evaluating moving to the cloud is identifying publishing content versus collaborative content. So in the past, it was very common to maybe have a site that was collaborative that was locked down to the department team members where they did work. And then you had a site that was public that everybody came to, which was your publishing platform. It was your intranet that people came to you to find information about. That to me is the delineation between SharePoint sites and Teams, right? So when you think about migration, we could think about, does this belong in Teams as a piece of Teams content that we collaborate on with a small subset of users? Or does this belong as a full-on SharePoint site or an intranet where it's generally accessible by the masses, right? It's a read-only copy for everybody, even though there's probably a small handful of content owners that can actually change things.
Yeah. Well, it's okay. So speaking of migration, what about, third-party tooling? It's been a while. I've done, hands-on migrations myself, but it's been a number of years. There used to be all sorts of third-party Quest. Dell had a tool, and ShareGate was kind of new, emerging. I think they've really seemed to come a long way. But Microsoft had some native migration tools as well, but it was brutal. It was not fun working with those. It was so much easier with like a ShareGate. Is that still the case, or have some of the native migration tools gotten better?
Yeah, the native migration tools have definitely gotten better. So we have what's called SPMT, the SharePoint migration tool, that allows us to grab sites and lists and move them up to the cloud. It's a free tool. One of the things I like about it is it can be repeated. So you can create job definitions that are easily repeated. You can use date and time ranges for incrementals. So you can do a lot. It's kind of a vanilla migration tool. And then you can step into like an AvePoint or a ShareGate. all of them have the primary thing of repeatability, right? We can't just migrate once. And we'll talk, I think, a little bit about some strategies of how we migrate, but we need to continually migrate content, right? Because it's always changing. So we need a tool that can do that. And some of these tools that do that better than others. For example, ShareGate and AvePoint both have full-on PowerShell modules you can use to kind of automate some of this deployment of content. But Microsoft's internal tools have come a long way. I mean, you can move full-on file shares up to OneDrive, and then you can use the tool itself to migrate independent SharePoint pieces. The key thing to remember with some of these tools is that there's going to be some mapping involved, right? The old site template, there's only 2 site templates in SharePoint Online now. It's a communication site and a team site, that's it. In the past, we had community sites, we had blog sites, we had all these site templates that are no longer supported. And so there's always some transformation of the data of what it is today and how it's going to be in the cloud. And sometimes that necessitates a tool that can crack open PowerShell. Again, my preference, the Swiss Army knife, you can go and do pretty much anything you want with PowerShell that a tool can do. But of course, the barrier to entry there is much higher. So sometimes the tool is just necessitated based off of what you need to do. But I would definitely take a look at the SharePoint migration tool as a first step.
Okay. Yeah. And I didn't even think to include that, but that's another kind of component in the cost equation. I mean, probably a rounding error relative to those other things that we talked about, right? I don't know what ShareGate cost. It would be, I don't know.
I think it's 5,000 per seat.
$6,000. Yeah. So, pretty, that's going to be negligible relative to, whether like, customizations, rebuilding customizations. I mean, that's going to cost you much more than $5,000.
Right.
Just one of them will. But you mentioned migration strategy. Like I've heard you talk about like a live migration strategy. What is that?
Yeah, so the live migration strategy, and that we tend to try to use that as a way, use a tool or whatever tool you're using, build it in a way that can continually migrate content to the cloud, right? You can do that in stages. So you could do, an initial migration, then kind of periodic incrementals up until live date. I like to do it on a schedule where it's constantly moving, right? I create news items or I create content in my current intranet, and I'm migrating that up on a certain cadence to the cloud. And that gives me a couple benefits. One, I can test that content in the cloud without them to duplicate the effort. And I can validate that the value I'm getting from it on-prem is the same value I'm getting in the cloud. And I'm also validating that my migration strategy is working. So I'm getting a lot of benefit from building my migration solution in a way that's continually moving stuff to the cloud. And I don't have to duplicate content and all those types of things. So we like that strategy just because it gives, and from our perspective, gives the firms direct access and very agile ways to kind of iterate and see sites kind of come to life from a classic to a modern standpoint. But it also doesn't lead you into a kind of big bang full cutover where it's like, gosh, let's cross our fingers and hope this works. We're already going to get some insights into how those things are working along the way as we migrate.
Yeah, and incremental approaches to migrations or deployments, anything like that. It's a good idea. There are surprises. Like there are no more vanity URLs in SharePoint Online, correct?
Right. Yeah, and we have a lot of firms asking. Some firms that haven't been in SharePoint Online a ton didn't realize that, right? That we don't get to call it, whatever.domain.com. It's you're on SharePoint.com. That is your domain. Now you can create, internally if you want a kind of a nice vanity URL to kind of send them as a redirect that they always remember, right? You can do that. But ultimately, you're going to be getting the tenant ID that was created with your tenant. And in some cases, most cases, that URL makes sense. SharePoint's one of the only places you see the visibility of what was picked, right? The .onmicrosoft.com that you created when that tenant was first created is the one you'll see that in SharePoint. Everywhere else, you see your corporate domain name. And so that name is kind of stuck with you. And I don't even think Microsoft gives you much opportunity to change it anymore.
There are differences. SharePoint on-prem, you were on, the nature of an on-prem application is you control resource utilization, whether that's storage, CPU, bandwidth. Microsoft gave you a lot of latitude to sometimes get yourself in trouble. Let's be honest.
Right.
But, in a multi-tenant environment like SharePoint Online, that all that stuff has to be very closely managed. I remember Microsoft's first attempt at a development model to take those considerations. It was like sandbox web parts. Do you remember those?
Oh yeah. Where it could use a certain amount of resources allocated to the site.
Exactly. Yeah. And there were a lot of challenges with that. I haven't cracked open Visual Studio in a lot of years, but I'm sure things have gotten better. So, just kind of tying a bow on this, like are there any other considerations that firms need to evaluate as they're planning for a 2024 migration to the cloud? Any kind of last words on that?
Yeah, the one thing I would say is, and we do this here at Infodash, is looking through your content and looking at it with a lens of, can this become a page? Historically, it's easy to crack open a list.
Mm-hmm.
Lists are analogous to a SQL table. They're very powerful. We can do a lot with lists. From a publishing kind of platform and an intranet, pages are they're modern, they're mobile responsive, they look nice, right? Can the content become a page? And in Infodash, we're answering that question at probably 75% of the time. It can become a page, right? Pages still have taxonomy. You can still use them in the way you would use a list. But if you're looking at things that are going to actually hold content, it's better to put it into a page. And a good example, kind of the easiest example, is we have firms that have for years stored news items in a list, right? The challenge that creates in the cloud is that I need to create a viewer page now that can display the content from that list, or I can send the user to the backend list, which is generally not preferred because we don't want users going to what I call the backstage or a SharePoint list. We want to give them a nice polished news article that they can read. Even using the out-of-the-box capabilities of Microsoft today, you would not be able to do that. So considering taking that news list and in the path of migration, converting it to a page is valuable, because now wherever it shows up in search, wherever it's used, that link is going to bring you to a full-on modern page. So that is a huge consideration. Not every list is going to be a great candidate for that, but looking at it through that lens of, how do I not just lift and move the content like it is today, but look at what's a better way to maybe store it in SharePoint Modern. And of course, there's that you take that piece of content bit by bit, right? It's not a blanket answer for everything, but that would be one key consideration to moving to modern pages.
Good stuff. Well, we covered a lot of ground there. The catalyst here for this conversation was we've just had so much dialogue with firms that are trying to get a handle on what costs would look like for budgeting purposes for next year, because firms are finally moving in earnest to SharePoint Online. It's been a progression to the normal sequence of things in terms of on-prem to M365. You usually move messaging first, right? Because it requires a lot of resources, right? And at least getting Exchange running in hybrid mode, that's usually step one. Get your and then collaboration. This is a secondary thing, but it's finally happening now. So I know a lot of firms are grappling with this and trying to get their arms around cost. Well, this has been good. I appreciate you spending a few minutes here, and hopefully everyone got some value from it. And then my guess is we may end up doing an episode just diving in each one of those cost components to the equation. We could spend 10, 15 minutes on. So sure. if there's demand for that down the road, we'll do it. But I appreciate you joining me today, and we'll chat again soon.
Absolutely, anytime. Thanks, Ted.
Awesome. Thanks, Cam. Thanks for listening to Legal Innovation Spotlight. If you found value in this chat, hit the subscribe button to be notified when we release new episodes. We'd also really appreciate it if you could take a moment to rate us and leave us a review wherever you're listening right now. Your feedback helps us provide you with top-notch content. Want to dive deeper into the world of legal innovation? Connect with us online at getinfodash.com, where you'll find additional resources and articles. You can also follow us on social media at getinfodash to stay updated on the latest news and insights in the field of legal tech and knowledge management. Once again, thank you for joining us today on Legal Innovation Spotlight, a fireside chat series hosted by Infodash.